Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We have a great workshop lined up for you here from ASMGI and the Third Party Risk Institute. And I'm going to kick this over right now to Steve Racing, President and CEO of ASMGI. Steve will work the controls and speak, and we'll just get moving right now. Thanks a lot, Steve.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Thanks, everyone on the call, for sharing some of your time with us today. And I'm really excited to be here, today. It's a great topic, relevant and timely, I think, both, but managing third-party risk as it relates to innovation, it's just incredibly exciting, and really excited to have share the stage, the virtual stage, if you will, with Linda Chapman. Thank you so much for being here, Linda, and just really excited. Linda's the CEO of the Third Party Risk Institute and president of Untitled Performance Solutions. Many of you know Linda. She's been in the third-party risk space for quite some time, and truly an expert. So we're going to talk some about that. I'm Steve Racing, president and CEO of ASMGI, and I'm going to dig in a little bit, Linda, on your specific credentials. But before we do that, we'll talk a little bit about the format of today and just kind of an overview of what we're going to cover and those kind of things. So, as Paul mentioned earlier, it's a workshop. The format is a workshop, so our goal is for it to be very interactive. You have control of your own microphone, so if you have some comments or questions or want to chime in any way, please do so at any time and just unmute yourself and go ahead and speak and say whatever you want to do. So that said, from an agenda standpoint, first we're just going to do some brief introductions and overview. We're going to talk a little bit about the fundamentals of third-party risk, and move into roles and responsibilities, and then talk about specific innovations and how third-party risk influences them and how they influence third-party risk and such, and defining success. So that should wrap it up. We have 90 minutes scheduled for the day, so and a lot of really good content for you. So that said, Linda, I just wanted to dig into the details a little bit about your background, and what a phenomenal bio that you have here, and certainly your career highlights. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you very much. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today, Steve. I really enjoy this, and I've enjoyed all the preparation. And I also I just want to emphasize it's a workshop. It's not a webinar. So it is designed so that there's conversation between Steve and I, but also with the people that are participating. I do also want to make a special welcome to, there's several people that I know. They're my professional colleagues and my friends. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I just want to acknowledge that we have someone from Forrester, so thank you for joining us. I think it's really important to stay in touch with what's happening from an analyst perspective, and from one of the regulators, a financial services regulator, and also from NIST. So NIST is a very well respected organization that provides standards around many of the things we'll talk about today. So, and there's lots of people on the workshop today, so don't be shy. I mean, you know me, you can ask me anything. And I've gotten to know Steve quite well. I think you're going to find that it's a pretty candid conversation, so let's keep it that way. So with respect to my bio, I kind of grew up inheriting this as a chief procurement officer. So I've worked extensively in the financial services sector as a CPO. And so back, I guess, as early as 2000, I had my first kind of foray into this when I was responsible for supplier risk management, which honestly was about compliance, compliance to regs and laws. But I really got a good grounding in this when I moved to Fifth Third Bank in Cincinnati. And the US regulators they've done a wonderful job of drawing attention to the importance of third-party risk. And so I had, feet on the ground, a lot of experience in a bank that had some regulatory issues and was a poster child company for getting out from under that. And I joined just after that. So I got to know a lot of regulators super well. When you have risk problems, that happens. So anyhow, so throughout my career, I've made this a specialist an expertise for myself. And I really, there's very little else I do these days and have for some time. So this one thing leads to another. So I have a second edition of my book coming out. It should be out this month, although I see it's the 29th, so I better call my publisher. but it's third-party risk management driving enterprise value. And so what I've done in the second edition is really go in and broaden the references beyond the financial services sector and more broadly around the world. And I do want to acknowledge that we have people participating today from outside of North America. And we're finding that third-party risk management is kind of catching fire around the world. So I have my book coming out. I've added a bunch of new chapters to it and updated quite a bit of it. It really is the second edition. And I have a certification program, which some of you have been through, a certified third-party risk management professional. It's a 10-week e-learning program with facilitated conversation in the classroom and mandatory reading, et cetera. And it's an education in third-party risk and a good understanding on how it fits into operational and enterprise risk management. So it's not like a how-to course, but it is an education in risk. So that's a lot to say, but so I'll just pass it back to you, Steve, because
yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that, Linda. I think it really helps to put some context around that. And I, to your earlier comment, I really appreciate, how you became an expert in third-party risk, and it's actually by doing it, right? You were put in a situation where you didn't really have a choice, right? You were in charge of a program that maybe wasn't quite as mature as you would have liked. So you did a lot of the things that we're going to talk about. And I have a huge appreciation for that. And I just want to thank you for sharing, your knowledge and your wisdom with everyone. And I do want to mention the book. We're going to mention again at the end of the program, but just in case we run out of time, I want to talk a little bit about it here. Can you just reiterate what you have a new edition of this book coming out, and I think it's not released publicly yet, but it will be soon. So what can you just share that with us a little bit? And again, we'll talk a little bit about this at the end of the program as well.
Okay, well, having an education background, that was one of my lives before I got into being a chief procurement officer. It really is a briefcase size book. It's just a couple hundred pages in paperback, or it's also available as an ebook. And it really walks you through most of the chapters are set up the same way. Really, what is the context, either regulations or laws or practices that are expected in large organizations? And then the rest is applying my experience and what I've learned in working through in this area as an advisor, but also as the accountable executive. So the rest is like, well, what should you know and what should you be looking for in your own organization? And then I do a deep dive, I think, onto 8 different risk domains that are ones that cross all industries and around the world. So it has definitely a practical tone to it, but it's also anchored in one heck of a lot of research.
Excellent. Yeah, I love it. And I just, I'm feeling a little inadequate after a bio like that, Linda. It's very nice. And so, but what I want to shortcut to is just, I'll talk a little bit about ASMGI and just our thoughts around GRC in general, governance, risk, and compliance in general, and third-party risk really fits into that bucket. But what we see a lot from a cyber standpoint, we talk a lot about the thinking related to cyber and what we call our branded solution internally, we call One Team, which is basically a collection of principles. But I wanted to talk about an old way of thinking, which we call the point solution mentality, if you will, or mindset, right? So, and maybe some of us have experienced this in our enterprises, but it tends to be reactive by nature. And so what we see a lot is people just kind of knee-jerking and reacting to specific events in order to establish what's highest priority or, to implement some kind of security or cyber solution. It tends to focus on individual controls. And so I have a huge appreciation for frameworks like NIST. You mentioned is on the call. NIST is a great framework, and I have a huge appreciation for giving somebody some guidelines about how to implement security and how to protect yourself. The problem that we see with enterprises, though, is that they get so focused on, hey, I'm going to be compliant with this framework. So first I'm going to do control number 1, then control number 2, then control number 3, and just kind of move through from a project mindset, if you will. Just kind of step through the controls. And I think, you can tend to focus too much on controls. And then too quickly move on to the next one without fully implementing or adopting or those kind of things, the first one. So by virtue of that, it tends to be kind of fragmented and efficient if you think about this point solution mentality. And so what we see a lot in enterprises is that people are spending a lot of money and they may not actually be getting the benefits from that, from a security posture standpoint, right? May not be improving their security that. So in contrast to that, there's a new way of thinking that we call the holistic security mindset. This isn't a novel or a new idea. It's been around for a little bit of time. But if you think about it, holistic anything means looking at the whole. And if you do that, just again, by virtue of doing that way of thinking, it tends to be more proactive by nature if you're looking at the whole. And so focus on total solutions. Total solutions is a term that we coined at ASMGI, and we use it a lot internally. And again, our branded solution for that is called One Team. But it basically says this: it's not a total solution if it doesn't include a program plus technology plus operations. And by operations, what I mean is really looking at what it takes to do the things that you think are important to you as an organization. So those strategic objectives and those things become part of your program. In today's world, you need technology to help you and assist you in doing things and getting things done. And then operationalizing it is, somebody's got to show up to work tomorrow and actually do it, right? And somebody's got to show up the next day and the next day and the day after that. And so getting it done is where the operations show up. And again, by virtue of all these things, it ends up being gap-based. If anything is missing, then you have to fill that gap with a solution. It's risk-based by default, right? And it ends up being risk-based basically is a mechanism for prioritizing things. The highest risk things get done first and various different things. So anyway, net is, I think it ends up being that by default. And at the end of the day, what we see enterprises who adopt this way of thinking, typically spend less on security and actually move the needle, right? So it's, I just wanted to point that out before we start, because it certainly applies to third-party risk just like it would any solution.
So Steve, I'd like to comment on the whole concept first before we move on. So I really liked your comment about spending a lot of time and effort not to produce a substandard outcome. And that happens in kind of every element of risk. It's really easy to take kind of a compliance or checklist view of things, which is just not risk-based. But I guess if I step back and look at the whole thing strategically, you have a risk posture and a risk framework that you're trying to fit everything inside of. And then you build a bunch of tools and activities, and people do get distracted by those and think that that's kind of the point, and that will be what delivers good outcomes. But in fact, the real purpose of this is to give you risk insight in order to make fact-based decisions so that you can take the right actions. And that's that's the thinking part, right? Because if you use these tools well, it should lighten the workload so that you can actually have a little bit of thinking time, and then determine what actions would be most appropriate based on the risk insight you have in order to protect your organization or to respond to something. And that kind of gets lost. I mean, and I have to say, I do feel for people in information security jobs, cybersecurity, because there's always so many things to think about. However, but if they can step back and really have a close look at what is the point of what we're doing, right? It really is fact-based decision-making, risk insight. So I don't want to beat it to death, but that fits everywhere.
I 100% agree with you, Linda. And I think at the end of the day, as thought leaders or consultants or whatever you want to consider, people in this space, right, that our job is to give enterprises the information they need to make a good business decision, right? So I think you're spot on in that regard. So that said, let's jump into the program, if you will, and talk about some fundamentals of third-party risk.
Okay.
I'm sorry, do you want me to go back or?
No. I'm just agreeing with you. I think basically sort of moving on. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I'd like to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So first of all, I mean, especially when I work with firms who have not spent a lot of time on this, that the concept of a third party can be a little bit squishy. So some work I've done through Risk Management Association really is to nail down, well, what exactly do we mean by a third party? Well, it's your business relationships, excluding those with your clients. And so what a lot of people focus on first, which is a sensible place to start, is with your vendor population. And whether it's, sourced centrally or through some other process, in the long run, if it's paid through accounts payable, it's a vendor, right? No matter what you want to call it, it's still a vendor. And those are relatively easy in the grand scheme of the world to wrap your arms around. Nothing is ever easy, but the second type is really what we have coined this term is kind of this non-vendor third party, which is everything else. So the hard part about these, about even figuring out who they are, is they're typically acquired through the business itself. And in the financial services sector, we had come up with 19 categories and 53 subcategories of these non-vendor relationships, which are third parties. That may be correspondent banking, but if you go past the financial services industry and think more broadly, it could be any type of relationship, a joint venture, a channel partner relationship, perhaps a brand partnership. So quite often there is no financial remuneration, right? So that's what makes them especially hard to find, because you need to work directly with the business to identify them. And if you can come up with some terminology that is pretty easy to understand, like it's not a vendor, it's another type of third party, it helps you harmonize all those other terms in order to communicate better with what you're trying to achieve. So that's all I want to say on that. I think that, but if you come up with some definitions that people understand, it's helpful.
Yeah. I was thinking about this slide a little bit, and I certainly agree that from a vendor standpoint, it's easy to identify who they are, right? Because you do a transaction with them, you can just print something out most likely from accounts payable and figure out who your vendors are, right? But the non-vendors can be very tricky even to identify, right? So I think that's step number one from a risk standpoint. If you talk about foundational or fundamental elements, is really know who your third parties are. And a good example might be on a financial transaction, to your point, right? There are a lot of intermediaries who get paid and touch your data, who you may not have a direct relationship with. And so they still need to be considered. So let's talk a little bit about Lifecycle.
Yeah, so Lifecycle basically is just lifecycle management. In the end, basically, it's all about identify, assess, manage, and control your third-party relationships. And we'll talk a little bit more deliberately in a few minutes. But you really do need to cover the entire life cycle from, I need to have a relationship with a third party all the way through to termination. And by at least sorting out in your mind what the steps might be, the big steps, it allows you to do a better job of defining the small steps to get there. But some other language that you should be familiar with is this notion of risk-adjusted practices. We already talked about risk-centric a little bit, but risk-adjusted practices means it's not a one-size-fits-all. That is a losing proposition if you try to do that, because not everything is important, but many things do need to be managed. So having a risk-adjusted practices is predicated on having a segmentation strategy, and then basically finding a way to give appropriate risk treatment for each type of relationship. One of the easiest one to understand is business continuity management plans. So at one end of the spectrum for basically a risk adjusting it so there's not too much work effort, you might just need to know there is a business continuity plan. And at the far end of the spectrum, you might want to participate in testing. So these are two examples of a risk adjusted practice against a program.
Mm-hmm. And you would base that on how critical a vendor was to you, right? The vendor tiering, if you have a mechanism to rate your third parties as it relates to what kind of data they have or how critical they are to your continuity of operations and those kind of things.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. Yep. Okay, and then a few more terms on the next slide. Inherent risk, it can be confusing, but inherent risk is just risk that exists if you're going to do business with a third party without taking their controls into consideration. So back to your example, Steve, if you give them a lot of your data, then you have high risk right before you've evaluated control. So that's high inherent risk. So the risk controls basically, and this is something that I find over and over again, especially in talking with people who are less familiar with third-party risk, it takes a little while to understand that we're evaluating how the third party runs their own business, which is their control environment. Because if we can understand that and how, whether or not it matches our expectations and our control environment, you can determine whether or not you find that their controls to be acceptable. And whether not acceptable, that's where you have to have additional risk treatment. But people get confused, right? Because you're not looking at them operating in your environment, you're looking at them operating in their environment, because whatever they do can harm you.
It's hard. I think it's hard from a third party perspective a lot of times too, Linda, because when somebody asks a question about, how do you handle data, does it apply to how I handle their specific data, or does it apply to how I handle data in general? And I think when you evaluate a third party, you're trying to get to know who they are in general, right? How they behave when nobody's looking, because that's what really matters at the end of the day, right? Yeah. But it can be challenging as a third party to really know how to respond to some of these questions as well. And I think just defining the terminology and understanding the source of the risk helps as well.
Right. So if you understand inherent risk and you understand third party risk controls, it's easy to understand how you arrive at your residual risk, which is you've now thought about their controls and evaluated them, and the risk that remains is the risk that you're going to accept or not. So that's your residual risk. So enough said on that topic, really.
Yep.
Okay, and then the other thing that I just want to touch on is this whole concept of having a lifecycle management framework of some sort, a model, a framework. Because if you're going to identify, assess, manage, and control relationships throughout the life cycle, it's really a lot easier to explain to people what you're doing if you have a nice, simple life cycle management model. And that way, it allows you to determine what the activities are, who's responsible for what. Now, the piece, most people do have this, and it's usually a workflow, but I kind of like a visual because it's easier to explain to people. It's nice and simple. But the risk governance framework is, I hardly ever see this documented. It's kind of implied. But all the things that underlie your program, which are the methodologies, the reporting, the risk oversight, et cetera, are things that are usually embedded somewhere in a program. But I think if you can lift them out and have a close look at them and get your enterprise risk management people to look at them too, and perhaps your audit group, you have a better chance of actually being in sync with what the organization expects when it comes to risk management, period. And now in the context of third party.
Excellent.
Okay, so maybe we should move on to the discussion because I'm doing a lot of talking here. So I really would like people to wade in, or Steve and I would like people to wade in. Here's some things that maybe might be worth discussing. Do you have a formal program? I say in the financial services sector, the chances are pretty good you do, but I do know there's people from other sectors that are part of this today. And, do you actually have senior management support? Because we see a lot of compliance lip service, and that's at different levels, probably not at the top levels these days. And, is there even a chief risk officer, and are they on board with what you're doing? Because if they're not, you're out there in the wilderness. And back to that inventory of all your relationships, I'd be surprised if most firms actually have a complete inventory of their non-vendor third parties. And then the whole relationship management question is a big question. I see a lot of weakness in this area in the financial services sector. It's usually left up to the business, and there are certain things that you must do. So, how do you draw the line? And then this whole idea of maturity. So a lot of people do think their program's mature, and I'd like to hear from them if they think it is. Like, how did you get there? So let's throw it open, Steve. These are the kinds of things that I'm hoping people wade in, ask questions, or share. So don't forget to unmute.
Please. Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing, Linda.
Okay. Okay, so I am wondering if I could call on somebody that I actually know. Let me see. What about Janine Pumphrey? Are you able to comment on any of this? Okay. Yeah, not going to be a whole lot.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, if we don't have people. So I'm hoping somebody will wade in and share something or ask something. That's what a workshop is, right? Otherwise, it's a webinar.
Yeah, I see someone that's unmuted.
Hey,
Okay.
Linda.
Hello.
Hello. Hello. Hope you can hear me fine.
Yes.
Good. I'm Ella Coleman. I'm with the Federal Home Loan Bank in Dallas.
Hi there.
And first of all, I want to say thank you for your book. I made a presentation to my bank on it last year. It was very well accepted. And as far as your question, we do have a formal program established. We've had a program in place for 5 years now, at least. And yes, we do have a full senior management support.
Yep.
We also have a credit risk officer. Actually, our program is embedded within the ERM division, if you will, and we report ultimately to the credit risk officer for the vendor risk management. As far as inventory, we started out big. I remember back in 15, we got everything from account payables. And we're a small bank, so we don't have that many vendor overall, but we started out with over 500, and then we distributed the listing to the various owner and basically brought it down to the proper size, if you will. And we also use an exclusion list for certain vendors that are not really, the usual supplies and things like that. So we removed a lot of those. So right now we are about, we're staying level around 300 that are in the vendor risk inventory. That is not the account payable inventory.
Yep. That's a good number. That's actually a good number. That sounds manageable for the size of the organization.
Yeah. And also, let's see, as far as maturity, I've been using the security share assessment. They have the VRMM maturity program. Little survey. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yes, I used to be on their board.
Oh, okay, good. So anyway, I use that, and I've done it now for 2 years. This will be my third one. It's just internal, like it's meant to be, just for me to evaluate where we can improve. And last year we were below 4. We want to be a 4 because at the end of the day, we do have all the right elements in place. In certain area, we are a little light. You know what I mean?
Of course, yep. Nothing's perfect.
Right. And but at the end, you just have to, decide what you're willing to risk.
Exactly.
But our program is very, very, very visible to executive committees and ultimately to the board. We present quarterly. So I don't know if I answer your question.
Yes, you did. Yeah, I'd like to ask you, COVID-19 kind of changed the way that we're managing the relationships. So I'm actually working with a task force to try and figure out in what way have things changed. Is there anything that you could share that your organization might be choosing to do differently because of a lesson learned?
Well, let me put it this way. At least for our critical vendor, we pose a question to our vendor owner to ask if they have noticed any deterioration of service or other issue with their vendors, because they are really the one that can truly monitor performances, if you will.
Yep.
So we have not heard, or at least our vendor owners have come up saying no, they have not noticed anything. I know that at the beginning, our CIO had, of course, reached out to some of our most important vendors.
Yep.
Of course, for us, Microsoft is uber all. And so we are in touch with them all the time, which I'm sure is what everybody does nowadays. But, and of course they do have little issue, but I don't know that they are COVID related. They could be, but I doubt it. They'll come out and tell us that that's the reason. You know, that's the other issue. A vendor may not be willing to really, I don't know, tell you if they have problem because of COVID. All I can do.
And that's the thing. You know, let me run something by you. It's a different view of the world. So up until now, I've been a real advocate of looking at your segmentation according to criticality, as Steve pointed out, but also exposure to risk, right? And preferably exposure to residual risk.
Sure.
But you know, I've been kind of observing what's going on. And I think you're right. Everybody's focused on kind of the big guys, the tier ones. And I'll be honest, I mean, there's not a whole lot of problems with the tier ones.
Right.
So I think the lesson that I have learned, and I really am probably going to write an article or something about this, I think there's a dimension missing in what we're doing, and has been, and it kind of has been nagging at me for a while. So what I'm thinking is that dimension that's missing is, regardless of the segment, you know, your tiering segmentation or for the criticality, I think there needs to be some lens in terms of, is this relationship, you know, how does this relate to earning $1 of revenue against different products and services? Because not all products and services are equal, right? In terms of contributions, some of them are regulatory, so you have to deliver. And others are, in fact, you know, they are the greatest sources of revenue for your organization, that with, you know, things that keep you healthy. So I'm kind of thinking, I haven't quite figured out how to do this yet, but I think there needs to be the third dimension is in what way does this relationship relate to delivery of $1 of revenue for the product or service? So, and I think if you add that third element in, then basically my observation would be that, you know, if you had 4 tiers of criticality, where the problems are starting to show up is in your sort of tier 3, tier 4, occasionally in tier 2. But a lot of times there's no substitute for them either, right? So they real workarounds for any length of time. So now what? Yeah. So what do you think of that?
I know it's kind of difficult because we are concentrate, like you said, that we concentrate really on we have our, what do you call it? Segmentation is, you know, critical vendors and highly significant, which we group together and kind of do the same reviews on both vendors and the same efforts. But then we have the significant, which of course, you know, it is what it is. That's our third level. And then the minor, which again, on some of them, we don't even review them. And if we do, I mean, we review everybody at the beginning, the new vendor due diligence, but the ongoing monitor and the schedule review, for minor vendor, we really down to the nitty gritty, the least possible. But
well, it's all kind of something to chew on, right? Is kind of, where do we go from here?
Hey, Linda, we have a couple other people I think they want to contribute, if you don't mind. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Let me kick it over to somebody.
Brave. Yeah.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Mirella, for that input. It was great. It was great. Rabia, I see you have your hand up. You have to unmute yourself, but would you like to contribute, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Rabia Tayoub, and I head up third-party risk for the Standard Bank Group in South Africa.
Yeah.
Linda, I'm always nagging you on LinkedIn, so you probably recognize my name.
I do, actually. Yes, I do.
Yeah, so just to answer some of your questions, yes, we definitely have a formal program, and it definitely is driven from the top. So our entire group board is on board and have committed to the implementation of our third-party risk framework across the group. We operate in 21 different jurisdictions. So it's really exciting that we have the support from the top and also bottom up. Because we are such a huge financial services organization, operating in so many countries, we have the ones we know of for now, we have about 50,000 suppliers only. But so we definitely don't have a complete inventory, but that's part of our maturity where we aim to get there. And relationships throughout the life cycle, we have a Reserve Bank guidance note on outsourcing, and there's specific segments of relationships that are managed. But hopefully as our program matures, we using a risk-based approach to managing the relationship based on the risk associated with that third party. So that's just where we're at from a third party risk perspective.
Well, and you have a very, very challenging environment in South Africa. So first of all, South African Reserve Bank, I mean, that guidance has only been out for a couple of years. So, you know, so yep. Kudos for as much work as you've done. And the other thing is though, that in South Africa, I have a close professional relationship with someone there who is a chief procurement officer in your sector. And so my understanding is that the supply base is fairly mature compared with other parts of the world. And so I'm guessing they might have a hard time stepping up to some of your requirements. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the maturity from a third-party risk perspective is not there yet. So we do struggle a lot, especially with, you know, trying to get the life cycle embedded, where we try and use the concept of third-party questionnaires and getting them to answer that. Also, I think with because it's not yet very mature here in South Africa, there's not too much of sharing. Like if you look at other countries with the SIG and having shared assessments and stuff, we're not very mature in that as yet.
Let me just wade in there. People share the questions, they don't share the answers very widely. There's a couple of organizations in place, but so don't think you're missing out on anything. That is very mature in North America.
Okay, great. I just thought maybe we're a little behind, and that's why we're not mature, but that's great to hear. But we are trying our best, I think, because we also because there is that focus on third-party risk, and like you mentioned with the COVID, there is that huge focus and now heightened, where third-party risk is now heightened in organizations.
Well, thank you for saying that. I personally think it is. Now, don't forget that in Camel's services sector, it's one of only 4 things they can measure, the regulators can measure in your safety and soundness exams. Like, that's why it's a board agenda item, right? They have made it so. So it's, yeah, it is and besides, third party is sort of popped up sort of in the top 3 to 5 for a lot of senior executive teams.
Yep, definitely in our organizations. So I think we are starting to get the buy-in from our third parties as they are also maturing in this process, and they do understand with the pandemic, you know, the risk associated not just with them, but with the ecosystems of subcontractors as well. So that's something quite important. And then just going to...
Yeah, and the good news is, though, there's lots of people who have actually gone through the pain that you're going through now. So you don't have to figure it out. You just need to figure out which of the practices would you like to adopt, right? Because a lot of people have already figured out the practices, and that's the good news.
Yeah. Just from your COVID question earlier, I just wanted to share with you some of our learnings. I'm sure you're all aware of the strict lockdown regulations in South Africa, but I think something that made us really look at our segmentation was around essential third parties. And the reason I say essential is because that's something that was gazetted here in South Africa, where during the lockdown period, only essential workers could work. We then went to our critical third-party list, and if you look at the critical third parties, those are all of the big guys. And like you said, they were not the problem, but we needed the cleaners and the call centers and people that do sanitizing, and where that left us with this new list of essential third parties that we really need, the frontline, the third parties that contribute to our front line and also keep the lights on, basically.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I think that's a really good observation, and it's another dimension.
I think it's a great observation too.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. You know, and one of the things I think we'll move on, but I think one of the things that I just from listening to these questions and that's interesting to me is that, particularly as it relates to COVID, is the list of essential vendors changes. It can change, right? And I think that's something that everybody has to be acutely aware of, is that if the environment changes, so maybe the way that you've rated your vendors and various different things and whether essential or non-essential might change as well.
Absolutely.
I know there's some other people who have likely some great input, but we're going to keep moving, and you'll have plenty of chances, I think, to contribute along the way. So please be patient, and we'll get to everyone, I'm sure. Go.
Yeah,
you want to talk about a little bit about roles and responsibilities?
Yeah, because don't you hate it when they don't get through the whole deck? Anyhow, so thanks. So the 3 lines of defense framework that you can see is it's adapted from the IIA's lines of defense. And I like it because it actually shows an external audit, the board, senior management, regulators, et cetera, which are not in the standard framework. And so I only bring this up because in the long run, all the work gets done. And the lines of defense is a really helpful way to really clarify. So one of the things that I'm not particularly fond of is this notion of you've got the first line of defense, which is the owner of the relationship and therefore the owner of the risk. And so a lot of times organizations tack on what they call a 1.5. And a 1.5 is people like third-party risk management professionals, procurement professionals, et cetera, who are actually not, in my mind, in the first line of defense. They don't own the risk. They're helping the first line get to the right place. I have actually had this conversation quite often with chief risk officers to encourage them to place everybody in the second line of defense, which is really those risk specialists and the risk oversight function that helps keep things moving forward and doing all the right things. So, and I'm not very fond of the 2B as a result. So 2A is typically the enterprise risk management and function, right? This is the one in the center. And then they come up with this 2B, which is everybody else. That's like super confusing for the business. And so our internal audit is the third line, is like nice and clear. I'm very fond of a very simple model. And if you think about what that means, it helps you figure out who does what in a sensible program. So Steve, I'm sure you want to comment on this because you run into all kinds of people in organizations and roles can be unclear.
Yeah. Well, I think the one point that you made, Linda, that really resonated with me was like, who owns the risk, right? That's the organization, and that is the first line of defense. And at the end of the day, positioning them to make a good business decision is critical. And I think that's what everybody else's job is to provide the information to the people who have to make a good business decision. And they have to be the people that own the risk. The business has to get involved. And, just from all the comments from the audience and various different things, Linda, the one thing, again, that really resonated with me was I think the maturity of a program is based on management buy-in and transparency at the end of the day, right? If those two things exist, there's a very high likelihood that you'll get there, even though there's still a lot of work to do, right? But if they don't exist, you won't get there. You will never get there. And I think that became, very obvious in the comments that we got, that those things existed and were in place. And so that's great news, quite honestly. But I think in today's world, we're becoming more aware of the fact that third parties present risk to our organizations. And so they're getting more attention probably today than ever. But I think those two things need to ring true.
I'd just like to ask you a question, because I really like your overall framework where it's not just the controls or the tools, et cetera, but it's the operationalizing them as well. So if I could just ask you, I know our job is to produce risk insight for decision making, but I'm guessing that you don't stop there, because if you just give people information they don't know what to do with, then what? So can you just talk to how to frame risk insight in a way that people could take action?
Yeah, I think you have to identify what problem are you trying to solve, right? And I use vulnerability management as a metaphor for this. So it's a little bit different than third-party risk, quite honestly, but it's a very easy topic to grasp. The objective of vulnerability management, a lot of people say, hey, we put a scanner in place, and so we have a vulnerability management program. And what I always say is that the strategic objective is not to identify the vulnerabilities, it's to remediate them, right? You actually want to lower your risk. You want to improve your security posture. That is the goal of the organization. And you can only do that by doing the operational piece, right? You have to do it every single day. It's hard work, quite honestly. But just by putting a scanner in place does not lower your risk, right? So it creates the information, though, that you need to be able to lower your risk. And so it's critically important to the process, but it's only part of the process. And so I think you know, one part that we tend to focus on a lot is make sure you're asking the right question, right? And the program is what defines what your strategic objectives ought to be. And if we can help people understand if their program aligns with their appetite for security and their, you know, their corporate objectives overall and those kind of things. But I think it's critically important to make sure from a risk standpoint that you ask yourself, what answer am I looking for? What does success look like, right? What kind of risks are we trying to flush out, or what kind of problems are we trying to solve?
Well, yeah. And so if I think about what someone told me a couple of weeks ago, I actually a fairly senior person, so I was kind of surprised. So they did a bunch of analysis and turned up a big risk profile on certain things. And then they went to their senior management team and kind of handed it over and said, okay, so here's a big long list of risks. And I wasn't overly surprised that that got turned back, because it's like saying, here's your vulnerability. And then someone who is not conversant in this, how are they supposed to know what to do?
How do you know what to do with that information? That's exactly correct. That's exactly correct. There's a whole I'll say category of solution today, you know, called MDR, which I think falls into that category: manage, detect, and respond. It's great in theory, and I do think it's evolutionary and in helping us all protect ourselves from threats and those kind of things. But detection is not prevention, and detection is not proactive. It's reactive, right? It's something that's already happened, and somebody notices it and raises a flag and tells you about it. Now you still have to know what to do, and you still have to actually do it. And so I think that's where the secret sauce lies, is in addressing those issues. The same applies to third-party risk, quite honestly.
Okay, I'm going to ask you some questions about sort of the AI of that when we get there. So anyhow, but this is, you know, I thought we'd open it back up again, Steve, and see what people think. I find that these questions seem obvious around kind of a racy, but do you go into organizations and find that there's some blurriness where more than one group thinks they own something, or maybe nobody thinks it?
Accountability is the one that really jumps out at me, because you know, we have this concept about if more than one person is accountable, nobody is accountable, right? And so there's this read, it's a really good read actually. It's called Scaling Up. It's about the Rockefeller habits and all those things. It's a good book, but it talks about accountability, responsibility, and authority. And the example it uses is that the accountant is accountable for finances. Because they count them, right? So to be accountable, you have to count something, and you need to be able to say, hey, we have more money going out than we have coming in. This is a problem. And so the accountant is the person who is best in a position to count the finances and say, hey, there's a problem, right? That's accountability. Accountability is raising your hand. Responsibility, everybody is responsible for being fiscally responsible, managing expenses well, and doing those types of things. But the business owner is the one who has the authority to do something about it and say, we're going to spend X number of dollars here, we're going to spend X number of dollars there. And so there's a huge, the most of the issues that we see is really about the accountability part, right? And it's real easy to pass the buck to somebody else. Well, that department is accountable, or we're accountable with them. You know, I hear a lot of people say that from a third-party risk perspective, it's both a procurement issue and a cybersecurity issue, and so we're both accountable for third-party risk, right? But you can't have multiple parties accountable for something. So those are some of the challenges that we see.
Yeah. So I mean, basically, and then sort of it's breaking it in smaller bites to figure out what exactly do you mean that you're accountable for. But now I just want to ask you another question. When it comes to cyber risk, I do see where, you know, it's almost impossible to nail things down. It's never a question of, oh, you're going to have a breach. It's kind of when and how bad is it going to be. So I've seen a number of instances where the people who are responsible for doing the third-party assessments feel somewhat reluctant to take ownership of calling it whether or not it's okay, right? So they'll present a bunch of findings and say to the business, well, you have to decide whether or not to accept the risk. But it's back to that overall, you know, accountability and responsibility is, you know, what is their role in calling it to say, you know what, I don't think this matches our risk tolerance or our appetite.
Right. I think it goes back to the lines of defense slide that you talked about, right? It'd be really nice to assume that a second or a third line of defense is going to make the call on whether to accept or how to treat a risk, right? But it's really the person who owns the risk who has to make the business decision on how to treat the risk. So for certain types of violations, you may have a program or a policy that says, if this, then do this, or, you know, if you see this, then do that. But when it really comes right down to it, when people assess their vendors, if they find someone or their third parties and they find someone who poses some risk to the organization, the tendency is on the incumbent, right? So I think the tendency that we see with enterprises is to accept the risk and move on, right? And say they're a vendor who has a challenge here, and we're going to assess them again next year, and hopefully that one will be fixed, right? But a year is a lot of time on the cyber clock or the technology clock, right? That's you could get breached tomorrow, or it's not if but when, right? So I think that what we're seeing as a trend in third-party risk is people are starting to take it more seriously. And so if somebody, I sum it up like this: risk assessments in the past used to say, do you do DR? And everybody said yes, right? And then they said, send us your DR policy, right? And so now people are going,
no.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
no,
yes, of course we do it. Let's scramble and look on Google and find a DR policy so that we can submit something for this. And now people are saying, if it's a critical vendor especially, right, or an essential vendor, especially, people are saying, well, do you test your DR to make sure that it worked? Because DR, and this goes back to making sure that you're answering the right question, DR is never about backing the data up. DR is about recovering the data. Right? You have to be recoverable.
That's the recovery, yes, absolutely.
That's right. It's actually about being recoverable. And so anyway, net is people are saying today, not just do you do it and show me your program, but let me participate and make sure that our data is recoverable with you. And I think if you do that, and it's always going to be an evolution, right? But tomorrow's not going to look like today. The environment's likely to change, right? So I think we have to continue to evolve. But getting stricter about those things, I think, is where third-party risk is heading, and I'm happy about that, quite honestly, because I think it's important.
Well, and I just want to make one more point before we open it up, Steve, is that this whole notion of accepting the risk, this is a huge cultural change for organizations. So anybody who's relatively new to this, in the past, basically, the business could accept pretty much any risk when it came right down to it. And basically in a rigorous risk management environment, that's really not the case. So there's this concept of effective challenge. So the accountability and the responsibility of people who are risk specialists is if they think that the risk is exceeding the risk appetite of the organization, but the business is willing to accept it, is to make sure that gets escalated up to somebody who can actually wade in, who has the authority to say, gosh, I'm sorry, but you can't do that, right? So you don't escalate idly, but nor do you, just let the business accept the risk. And that is a huge cultural change for almost every organization I've ever been in. So anyway.
And I think that's a critical piece of a RACI diagram, is to understand that everyone's really responsible for protecting the organization at the end of the day. So if somebody sees something that isn't right, just raise your hand and say something to someone who has the authority to actually do something about it. I think that's critically important. We got to, let's reach out to the audience and see. We got a couple people that, so I see a phone number. It's a 917 phone number with no name next to it that's unmuted. Would you care to share some information? Do you want to speak or?
Yeah, hi. I think it's my number. This is Payal. Hi, Linda. How are you?
Hi, Payal. I'm excellent. So Payal's from the UAE.
Yes, so that's why my number starts from 971. Okay. Anyways, I'll be short here so that other people get a chance to talk. Okay. Thanks, Linda. This RACI matrix definitely works, but the only challenge which we face is that, as you rightly said, that risk acceptance by the first line of defense.
Yep.
So this is the most challenging part. So I don't know, I have tried to apply this in my organization because first line of defense, they are not accepting the risk. They think this is a layer which has been added and it's delaying the contract process or this thing. So I have made it very mandatory that in only when the risk assessment happens, the due diligence happens, then only accounts payable will process the invoices and make the payment. So I don't know if this approach is right or not, but this is working
it'll
for
help.
me, you know.
It'll help, but
It'll help.
yeah, but if they're not going to accept the risk, who do they think is? Like,
Exactly.
seriously. Yeah, no, but who honestly, who do they think is going to accept the risk? You?
So I think everyone wants to play the blame game, you know, okay, it's not me, it's you and all that, you know. So probably, I don't know, this approach has really helped me that, you know, none of the invoices will be paid. So I'm sticking to that.
Yeah, because basically, you know, sooner or later your bank will have to pay them, but because you're you know, that's unavoidable. But it certainly does put a little pain in the process. I'm kind of wondering if you might be able to prevail on your on perhaps your chief risk officer or someone in audit to help you pay out, because that's ridiculous.
Yes,
sorry, I'm not accepting risk, but I want the services. Okay, that does not compute.
Anyways, I'll give a chance to the others to talk. Thank you so much for the
okay, we can talk offline more about that, but that's just plain silly. Okay. Alrighty. So if there's nobody else,
I think we should move on.
Okay. Yeah, because we want to get into the innovation. So I'm going to try to spend not too much time on this. So Steve and I are going to kind of go through some of the things to think about. So innovation and change, there is a lot happening out there. Really, we're seeing the M&A is just sometimes it's head spinning. And then I also have to observe that in every industry, you're getting kind of eaten alive by monolines. I mean, they're new to the party. They don't often have the regulatory oversight or the legacy systems or whatever to drag along behind them. And they can be very, very effective competitors, and they eat the most profitable parts of your business. So that's a problem. And then, you know, this reliance we've already talked about, but the environment itself is kind of interesting. We're seeing what's happening with COVID-19. So if you are not doing, you know, really updated financial health checks on your third parties, now's a good time to start, because we're seeing that there's some real shakiness. Cyber risk is up. Do you want to comment on that, Steve? I'm sure you're seeing cyber risk go through the roof.
In fact, we are, yeah. So, and it isn't just, I mean, in financial services, there's a lot of fraud that's happening, but we see it across the board as it relates to COVID, especially, you know, a lot of fraudulent emails and phishing exercises and things like this. But if you think about, you know, if you think about the bad guys and try to put on your bad guy hat for a second and get inside their head, they want it to be easy. And so they look for times where we're distracted, or, you know, we have an opportunity to, you know, probably be more likely to do something, you know, unintentionally than not, right? So, and COVID has certainly given us plenty of opportunities to do that, aside from the different set of technologies that are involved with work from home and all those things that come along with it. So there is a spike in cyber activity, there's no question.
Mm-hmm. Well, not only that, I mean, I don't even know how people could possibly enforce their privacy policies when people are working in crowded environments and from home. So it's, you know, that things have changed. And then also people really have a real challenge with this sort of multi-geography. I've seen a number of financial institutions in North America pull back services that had non-public personal information in them from offshore vendors, right? That they don't want it to be out there for a variety of reasons. And so that's a bit challenging. I'm not seeing people necessarily withdraw from relationships. But what I have to say that in the healthcare sector, there are a lot of third parties falling on their nose. Now, if you think about the way the healthcare works in the US, no big surprise, people are not using the services. So all of the downstream services that support that, you know, the healthcare are really suffering, and many of them are closing their doors with no warning. And then the turnover, interestingly enough, has always been a real challenge in terms of employee turnover. But I'm seeing, I mean, maybe it's my imagination, I can't even tell you how many people I've talked to lately who have a brand new job. So that's like pretty tough in this environment when you're not in the office, but also it leaves a pretty big hole to fill behind these people leaving the organization. So, you know, things are always in flux, but they just seem a little more so lately. But I would like to let's talk about the technologies. I mean, there's so many out here. There's just sort of a long list, and I'm going to go through a few of them rather than try and talk about all these at once. So let's move on to the next slide. So when you think about what has changed the world, I think when you put these three things together, robotic process automation, cloud and big data analytics, and then there's many terms for it, cognitive automation, AI, and IA. So RPA basically is very, very attractive if you're not super familiar with it, because it just sits on top of existing platforms, right? It is a series of, they're not robots at all in the services industry, they're little tiny programs. And so those small programs basically can use machine learning, et cetera. And they're based on models, they can change themselves. It's very interesting, but you can, and the dramatic change is quite something. So when you take a bunch of people who are doing a job and then you replace them with robotic processes, it changes the risk profile. And in particular, the information security risk profile goes down a lot, but other risks go up. So I don't know, do you want to comment on this, Steve? Basically, what is the difference between having machines with passwords and others? People?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, you know, I always go back to the quotable quote, if you will. The good thing about a computer is will only do what you tell it to do. The bad thing about a computer is it will only do what you tell it to do. And I think this is true of all of the new technologies that are coming out, right? And so as you talk through some of the challenges, Linda, from some of these technologies, they kind of all roll back to this, right? So RPA, you know, conceptually, it's software, right? It's software defined everything. We live in a world, software is eating the world. That's, you know, kind of the quote that speaks to this. But, you know, so people are writing programs to answer the phone or to do tasks, you know, routine tasks. But so there are a couple, I think, phenomena that are happening at the same time. One is, I call it scalability. It's just the sheer volume, the sheer number of, you know, call it transactions or amount of data or whatever it is. It would be very difficult to have humans doing those types of tasks because you can't possibly hire enough people to do the work. And even if you could, you couldn't afford them, right? So it would be cost prohibitive. So you put a piece of automation in place to do a task that can pick something up from this pile and put it in this pile, or answer a phone and answer some fundamental questions and route it to the right place, or do something like that. So, but as we start to see the evolution of those things, I think this is kind of where you're going with your slide. You kind of step through artificial intelligence. First of all, I have a challenge with that term. It's not really artificial intelligence, right?
It's intelligent
real,
automation.
It's real
right?
intelligence, right? It should be called augmented intelligence, and because the true success and the true magic happens when you have, you know, AI or artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence plus a machine plus a human, not a machine or a human. And magic can happen when we leverage. So this is the thing that we talk about at SMGI a lot, is the difference between leverage and dependency. Dependencies are bad. You don't want a dependency, right? Because you're kind of at the mercy of something happening the way you want. But leverage is good, and you want to leverage everything that you can. And so automation and all of the technologies that are involved in automation really help you leverage technology to get more done with less, right? To increase your efficiency and those types of things. And I think that's the outcomes that are important when you start talking about all these new technologies. But, you know, one of the other things we talk about at ASMGI, we could drill into these technologies and spend probably 90 minutes specifically on any one of these topics, right? But one of the things we talk about a lot is it's more about the how than the what, right? And today it's even more about the why probably than the how, but the what's going to continue to change. You know, I remember when the what was cloud, right? Which made this list, but when the cloud was newer, I'll say,
Yep.
Everybody was all kind of geeked up about, hey, we're going to move everything to the cloud. I don't know how many enterprises that I had tell me, hey, we're going to go 100% cloud. And I was like, no, you're not. You've got a piece of stuff that it's impossible to run in the cloud, right? You're just, it's not going to happen. And then it was something else. And then it was AI, and everybody, you know, gets on board saying, hey, we do this, we do AI, right? What does that really mean? I don't know. And so from a risk perspective, I think that's what becomes important. What do you really mean you do AI? right? Does that mean that you're going to use my personal data for things that I don't know about, right? Does it mean you're going to combine it with somebody else's personal data? I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I think from a third party and from a risk standpoint in general, it's important to understand that if we just, sometimes you have to slow down to speed up, right? Just slow down a second and ask those questions, right? That might seem obvious, but they're not, right? Just ask them. Ask, what are you doing with my data? That's huge, right? It's a huge part of getting to the root of whether there's risk or not, just based on that.
Yeah, because we have so much data now, and it wouldn't really have happened without the other technologies.
Right.
And so basically, I'd like to go on the next slide and talk about some of the actual interesting risks.
Mm-hmm.
So on the next slide, we've got talking about.
Want me to go to the?
Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about this concept of AI, IA, NLP, etc. This cognition. So here's a risk that people are not thinking about, because it's usually this is driven by technology and legal, getting into these relationships.
Right.
But these machines basically can train themselves, which is a bit mind-bending, but it's true. And they can process natural language, etc. They can start dealing with all this data. And what I find really interesting is this, because let's say that you buy a technology with a black box in it, and the black box basically, and they promise you that it will learn, it'll improve, etc. Well, we do know that everybody rushes their products to market, and a technology company's view of the world around risk management and a financial institution or a different company's view of risk management are not going to be the same. And so think about it, the second you turn that machine on, it can start changing the output. And so some of the things that have already come to the fore is, well, who can turn it off again? How fast can we turn it off? How do we know that things are producing outcomes that are not what we expect?
Right.
And
right.
these are risks.
What do we do with the answer, right?
Yeah.
The machine says the answer is A, and we accept it as correct, right? Exactly. What if it's not correct? That's right.
Exactly. And these are risks that I'm be honest with you, I am not hearing them talked about very much. I think it's just sort of creeping up into people's awareness. But I think as good risk management people, we should be aware that these are questions we need to be able to figure out how to answer. Even if you can't see inside the black box, what controls can you put on either end of it to make sure that input equals output as expected, right? So
right.
That's something to bear in mind. And then the next slide is about very specifically about models and algorithms. I personally think that model risk is going to hop up into sort of a top 3 to 5. It's not there today, but I think it maybe should be. And so models and algorithms, I read a really good book, which I referenced on here, is this Kathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction. And the reason why I read all these books is because I had to write a chapter on model risk without the feeling that I actually could speak to it in kind of fluency. So I read this, I really enjoyed the book, an easy read in an afternoon. And then I read Models Behaving Badly by a quants expert, which was a very tough sledding. So, but what I learned really basically is these models and algorithms they're baked into just about everything these days in technology, right? Because software is eating the world. And I think that there's been a lot in the press lately about this unconscious bias and et cetera, and they're imperfect. So when I was writing the book, I had help from Christelle Bilodeau. She's a really smart person who works for a central bank. And I used to phone her and ask her questions like, could we talk about this? And so one of the things that I talked to her about is that these models are all built on historical data. And so how exactly are they supposed to predict the future when the future keeps changing, right? Or even the current situation keeps changing. So we had this great debate because she thought there had to be models out there that are built on something besides historical data. And we could find no examples. It was really an interesting conversation. But I bring this to people's attention because I really want them to think about the models that are baked into technology in particular, how to spot there's a model there, and then basically to make sure it gets to people who are quants experts so they can have a look and figure out what they can see about what this model does and whether or not they're okay with the assumptions, because it can definitely produce unusual outcomes.
Right. And in the early life cycle of a model, it will produce unreasonable outcomes. and in fact be wrong, right? And that's the segment of that process is called training the model, right? So you don't get the outcome that you want, you turn a dial and you change the mathematics slightly to get something that's more reasonable as an answer, right? So, but again, it's only doing what you tell it to do. So I personally think math is really cool, and there's a lot that you can do with math, and predictive analytics is no exception, right? But to your point, you're predicting the future, which nobody can do, quite honestly, based on historical data, based on what happened in the past. And that's all we know. All we know is what happened in the past. So it's an approximation at best, but it's certainly a guess for sure.
Yep, and all the data that we produced during COVID is going to become part of future models. And who knows, is this an anomaly or not? Anyhow, so I also, on the next chapter, I just wanted to talk a little bit about 5G networks, right? Because I was writing on technology risk, and when I was doing the second edition. So on the next slide I have, on this slide I have about 5G networks. So I thought, why is the US government so worried about Huawei? Right, that's where I started from. And then I thought, well, I just thought 5G was a next generation of 4G networks, right? They're just faster, smarter. Well, no, they're not. They're actually super, super different. So they're 10 times faster, and they're in the process of becoming 100 times faster. So that's good. I mean, basically, we can carry a lot of data, and that means that drivable, self-driving cars might be a little safer. And then it also, you can put a lot of devices on it. But the real trick here is that these signals only travel a very short distance. So they can't go through anything. They can't go through a building, a floor, et cetera. That explains why the 5G network I have in my office doesn't work anywhere else in my house, because I don't have a repeater to move it through the house. So that's really interesting. So then you just step back and say, okay, so first of all this software it's all running on software, which we don't understand and can't see anything in. And there have been incidents where telecommunication software has been a great source for stealing information. And then secondarily, think of the amount of hardware that it's going to take to get these signals around. And if you go to the next page, I actually have a bit of an illustration of how this might work, right? So this is network architecture. So it's got lots of architecture we would recognize, right? Local servers and some towers, etc. But what happens now is we're going to have to move these signals, you can't move them around a tree, through a wall. So you have to have a lot of hardware produced by who knows who's going to produce it. And then what I didn't show on this, because it would have been too messy, is there's also these low Earth orbiting satellites, which are part of the mix. And some of them are owned by countries and some of them are owned by private corporations. So it's a really, really complicated telecommunications infrastructure that supports 5G. And I personally think that some of the things I mentioned are going to change the risk profile of telecommunications in a very, very significant way. So that's why I threw that in here.
Yeah, just a quick comment on 5G. I think one of the challenges, again, if we think about it from a risk perspective or a third-party risk, and particularly as it relates to financial services, a lot of mobile devices, mobile phones. I mean, this is the most common use case if you think about it, but 5G enables all devices to produce tremendous amounts of data, right? So, but being able to do all of your banking from your phone is something that the U.S. has been trying to accomplish for quite some time, right? So, but that said, when you think about risk as it associates with having access to more data and those kind of things, I think it's critically important that you understand what data you have access to. Does that fintech app that you're signing up as a third party, do they have access to PII? Are you subject to compliance requirements for GDPR or California or New York or any of those things? What data do you have access to? I think the more technology enables, the more we're going to have access to, right? And so we have to put our own limits in place a lot of times in order to be able to control what we access. But I think it's critically important that people understand that. And I did have one question that came in from chat, Linda. I just want to put out there. What's your view on fintechs? Speaking of fintechs, and are they traditional vendor or a non-vendor? And how do we adjust our process to cater for the fintechs that do not want to complete multiple questionnaires? It's a great question. It's not really 5G related, but it is related to something that we talked about. What do you think about that?
Well, it is a real challenge for them. So I think that it was Iron Mountain that did this first. They stopped answering all these individual questionnaires, and they were one of the first ones to use the SIG, the Shared Information Gathering Tool, and they produced all of it, right? They answered all of it. So for them, it was kind of a once and done. And then they have, as many third parties do now, they have kind of site visit days, which will resume presumably once people are traveling again. And I really love the concept because you can go in on a site visit with other financial institutions or other like customers. Mm-hmm. You get not just the benefit of what you see, but you get the benefit of what they're asking and the conversation and the networking. So I think that it is, if you're in if you're in the US, the Fed actually has a list of 200 fintechs that they do regulatory exams on. What I have heard from my colleagues in the US is they would really like them to release the reports a lot sooner, because sometimes they're about a year later and things do change. But I think there are ways to evaluate the fintechs. I think it's been almost impossible to evaluate some of the large cloud providers because they have kind of almost a monopoly on the, sort of on the territory. And they will only let you see selectively some of their third-party audits within the scope of services. But back to it, basically, I think that there is a lot of safety in numbers, and collaboration is encouraged in the financial services sector around the world. And so I think that you could agree to, as a group, perhaps conduct due diligence if you have a particularly difficult to get into third party. And there are a few subscription services out there that have kind of, I hear mixed things about them, but there's TrueSight, and there's IHS Markit has a service as well where you can buy assessments that are complete. And then when it comes to cyber, maybe you could comment on that, because there are cyber assessments that you can actually subscribe to.
Yeah, in fact, we do third-party risk assessments, both from a program development, from a technology stack, and an operational aspect of it. And one of the benefits of leveraging a platform is scalability, and being able to do an assessment once and then have it used as a vendor, do an assessment once, become part of the platform, be part of the system, and then leverage it multiple times. So we can help with that as well. Yeah,
because and I think in the long run, coming up with your own bespoke questions is, I think it's really difficult. The third parties are more willing to respond to things that are more standardized. I mean, Shared Assessments is a for-profit company, but having said that, their shared assessments or their shared information gathering tool is widely used. So what would be the point of trying to write your own questions, right? There's well, last time I checked, there was 1,172 questions in there. Surely you could pick some that you liked, right?
That's right. That's right.
Most people sort of pare it down, but why invent the wheel? And also, why would you expect a third party to respond to something that's bespoke for you, right? Because it's all the same stuff.
Yep. And we work with a lot of firms who have very, I'll say, good programs in place. That are blessed by the auditors, but they're spreadsheet based, right? And they're based on their own questions. And the only challenge, I'm not saying that it isn't good, I'm saying that it likely isn't scalable. So I'm a firm believer in spreadsheets. In fact, I tell my people a lot of times when they say, hey, we got to buy a platform for this, I'm like, do it in a spreadsheet first, because it forces you to figure out how to do it, right? And then we'll buy a platform. But it isn't very scalable, quite honestly, right? There are a lot of things you can't do in a spreadsheet in order to increase the volume and do those things. So as your number of vendors increases, and certainly as a third-party vendor. But we'll keep moving, because I know we are running out of time. Yeah.
We are. Okay. So I'm just going to, we have an interactive discussion. And one of the things I wanted to bring up is this whole question of innovation is, how would you do it safely? So I worked with a group of 3 other executives who were in the head of third-party risk management in large financial institutions of different stripes. And so we came up in the book, actually, I have a whole chapter on this, is how do you safely innovate? And so the principles are still the same, but typically you're asked to onboard these guys in a couple of weeks, and your processes probably take a couple of months. So, so this notion of an air-gapped innovation lab, which means it's not attached to your systems, is one that's it's been widely accepted in many institutions. And so I have this chapter is a bit of an anomaly in the new book, because it actually really is much more of a how-to about, you know, putting charters in place and what can be approved and spend limits and what data and the rule sets around that. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but basically you just have to get on top of this. And I'm hoping from some of the things we learn in using these strategies that we can speed up the whole process, because it is very, very slow to go through full due diligence and onboarding. And the more innovation you use, the less acceptable that is to your business. And my apologies, I actually have a Canadian client, so I keep saying process today.
That's funny.
It is.
Let's open it up for discussion. Does anybody in the audience have any comments or thoughts that they'd like to share?
Maybe if you show your next slide on your innovation lab, your concept, that might spark a few ideas.
Yeah, so we actually have it's a concept model that we deploy at enterprises that are you know, trying to implement innovative solutions and do innovation themselves, right? But I think it applies from a risk standpoint as well when you're evaluating people who are doing things. But it's a crawl, walk, run model, and it's something I advocate for completely, right? So crawl is about establishing a predictable outcome, right? And so the first question I think that you have to answer is, can we predict the outcome, right? So if we think we're going to get 1, are we going to get A instead, right?
Yeah.
And if so, just do a small sample size. And so if you're in charge of risk, I think if you're evaluating a new technology, you could look at a model, a crawl, walk, run model, as let's do a POC with them on a small subset of things and see if we can get a predictable outcome. That's so that would be the goal. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, if you could just explain the difference between a POC and a pilot, because people do use those words interchangeable.
Oh, yeah. So POC stands for proof of concept. And I'll be honest, a lot of vendors or third parties today use proof of value, POV, as a replacement term. It's just an acronym, and it's still a proof of concept to me. And the reason I call it that, and I like that term, is because what you're trying to do is prove out a concept, right? So from a crawl, walk, run perspective, the difference between a proof of concept and a pilot is size or magnitude, right? In a proof of concept, it's completely new, like something like RPA, for example. You might say, let's write this piece of software, or have somebody, or buy this piece of software and put it on one desktop and see if it does what it says it's going to do. I'm going to call the number and see if it routes me correctly, right? So that's a proof of concept. All you're trying to prove is that, yes, it works, or no, it doesn't. And then it's back to the drawing board from an innovation standpoint, or move to the next step, right? So a pilot to me is identifying a larger, but still a relatively small group of users. It could be a department, or it could be a location, or it could be, if it's Internet of Things related or related to 5G, it could be a larger sampling of sources of data or those kind of things. But let's define a user group that we can actually implement this and see if they all get the same. So I talk about it being more repeatable, right? So the first step, the crawl step is establishing if an outcome is predictable. The second step is establishing if it's repeatable, right? So can you get a predictable outcome for multi-users at the same time, or those kind of things, or whatever the case may be? But it increases the scale. And there might be some different criteria that you establish that you want to be able to check the box on that says it's okay. And then the third and final step is actually the more large-scale deployment. It could be enterprise-wide or multiple locations or whatever, but it's truly being scalable. And internally, when I talk about being scalable, I'm saying instead of doing something once or doing something 10 times, you need to be able to do it 1,000 times. And if you can think on those terms, even if you have 20 or 50 or 150,000 employees in your company, if you can think in terms of scalable, even being 1,000, maybe your pilot is bigger than 1,000. But again, if you think about in terms of it being scalable, it has to work across to everyone in your organization or everyone in the use case, and how do you get it to there, right? So if you can pass the predictable test and you can pass the repeatable test, then you move on to the scalability test. And to me, it's a whole new game when you start talking about scale, right? Because it just the quantities of everything are significantly increased, and it could significantly impact the way that you view risk, and particularly like if you cross country borders, for example, or in the US, even state borders, it relates to PII and privacy, right? Consumer protection and those kind of things. Every state kind of mandates their own thing, right? So if you cross state boundaries, and you're only US based, but what if you cross country boundaries and you have different privacy laws to comply with and those kind of things? So, but that's our innovation model. And again, we apply it mostly to people who are creating technology, but I think it applies equally as well if you're evaluating technology.
And you know, I mean, the next edition of my book, I'm gonna borrow this. I really like this. This is exactly what I was talking about. But I love your image.
Yeah.
Actually, I think that's terrific.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome.
So why don't we go on and talk about success? And I think we're almost out of time. But if we go to the next slide where I put up some ideas of what success might sound or look like, I would like to just open it up and see if anybody wants to wade in and share what their version of success has been. Like how did you get the level of support that you actually have? Is there anybody who'd like to make a final comment? Okay, so I think people are just starting to wrap up in their minds. So this whole concept of success, if you're talking about the activities that you are engaging in, it's probably not going to be as successful as thinking about why are you doing this? This is a version of ask the right questions, Steve. In the long run, if you ask yourself, what's in it for my organization or even an individual group in my organization to work with me and to support third-party risk management, these are the kinds of things that you do need to be delivering, right? Help them make informed decisions, you know, risk adjust the work ethic, et cetera. And I've got a different spin on it. It's kind of prevent, detect, respond, which is a spin on what you'd already done. And then the real why is protect your company, right? Protect your stakeholders and protect everyone from harm and losses. So that's, if you can't deliver those things, you probably need to go back and re-examine what you're doing, because it's all about value.
Agreed. And I think understanding the why is so important. You know, the cultural aspect of risk in general, and just even when we talk about security awareness training, you hear it all the time as it relates to cybersecurity that, you know, that unintentional acts lead to breaches a lot, right?
Yep.
And I think people have to understand risk, and it's so easy that I think everybody wants to do a good job. I believe everybody's good, right? Everybody wants to do a good job and do their best. But if your job is to get this, you know, packet of information to somebody else, and you can't use, the file's too big to use email, you can't use protected email, you can't do this, you can't do that, you're likely to find a way to do it, right? So what I mean by that is what we saw a lot of in the early days of like cloud storage and these kind of things is, you know, end users would, you know, Google cloud storage, I just need to transfer a file, right? And then they'd use a system that was free, so they didn't have to pay for it. Nobody would know about it. I would accomplish the business task that I was charged with doing, and all these things, everybody's happy, right? But what they don't realize is that there's an agreement, a click-through agreement on that free site that you went to that said everything you post on our site, we own. And so all of a sudden, this information that might just have a little bit of sensitive data in it is owned by some website or some such thing. But anyway, unintentional consequences, there's unintended consequences, I think, is a big thing. And so at the end of the day, I think just understanding why and making sure everybody understands why it's so important to protect the organization, and third parties are certainly a big part of that today. So.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. So I love that click-through example. I just was talking about with someone about that yesterday. But I do remember university, years ago, did a study, and they actually put in, and you're also going to give us your firstborn child. About 95% or 98% of the people agreed to that.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
So just in wrapping up, I know we're out of time, Linda. I just want to say thank you, and I really appreciate your wisdom and expertise around third-party risk. And I want to encourage anybody to follow up with Linda directly. And we are. Please let us know when your book is released. I definitely want to know for myself and anyone who attends the call. If you want some help getting the book, please let us know.
Okay. And thank you for inviting me to speak. And thanks everybody for being on the phone today.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye.